110 of the CRICKETher Weekly. And we're actually recording this about 24 hours earlier than usual because it's my hen do tonight. I'm so excited, Sid.
Good.
And so...
Citizens of Reading, beware.
So what that means is that if anything happens on Saturday afternoon, evening or early on Sunday morning, then I'm afraid it won't be covered in the broadcast, just in case anything major happens. So sorry about that, we're behind the times as usual. Anyway, okay, so Sid, we did have an interesting listener question after last week's podcast.
We did, one that really made me think. What was it, Raf?
It was from Christian Barrow, and he says, is under 19s the right age for a junior championship? Because of course we were talking about the ICC's under 19 World Cup that's going to be held in South Africa next year. He says, despite cricket being a game where players mature and play later than other comparable sports, why do we make the junior championship age younger than the standard of under 21 in sports like football and rugby?
Yeah, I thought this was a really interesting question. It's one that really set me thinking. I think that ultimately you have to ask what the purpose of the Under 19 World Cup is. And it's easy to see it like in terms of similar to other sports to go, well, we're nurturing particular players. So, and that's like kind of the obvious answer. So you go, well, if you look at the men's Under 19 World Cup team from 10 years ago, look how many of those players that were in that England team won it about 10 years ago and contained people like Ben Stokes that obviously went on, and several of those players went on to be top professionals. It helped to nurture those players, etc., etc. But I don't think the Under 19 World Cup actually is really about that. What it's about is forcing the boards to nurture their age group systems. So in a way, it's not about those individual players. It's about saying to individual boards, you need to nurture your system for schoolgirls and for age group cricket in order to provide a team for this. And that forces you to pay attention to that level and to pay attention to the level before people start becoming professional. So if it was about the individual players, if what we were trying to do was really give experience to people like the Alice Capseys of this world, then I think an under-21 tournament perhaps would make more sense. As would a rule saying, for example, that you couldn't play if you played in a full international for a full member country or something. But in the end, I've concluded that that's not what it's about. It's about nurturing those systems. And that's why it's so important that we've got 16 countries participating, because it's forcing all of those boards all around the world to look at their kind of girls' cricket and to nurture that side of the game, which is what's going to take the game forward, in 10 years, regardless of whether those people, and hopefully many of them will, but in some ways it doesn't really matter whether those individuals go on to play at the higher level.
It's perhaps another argument in favour of allowing players like Shafali Verma to play in these teams, because we all know that when you've got one really excellent player in a team, then that kind of ethos spreads and you're able to share that around a bit, and that some of the lesser known younger players will really learn from playing alongside a player like that. So there is a kind of development aspects there as well. Yeah,
maybe, and we might be coming back to that in a minute. It might be a theme that we're revisiting a bit later.
Okay, so thanks very much, Christian, for your question, and do keep sending in the questions and we'll keep trying to answer them. Whether or not you're happy with our answers is another matter. So, big event this week, the release of this year's Wisden, Sid.
Oh, we should have brought a copy down to hold it up, Raf. Imagine that I'm holding up a copy of Wisden. Those of you that are just listening on the audio-only version, Sid's holding up a copy of Wisden.
Yes, Sid is holding up a copy of Wisden. It's very yellow. Anyway, it's very exciting for us, despite the fact that, yet again, there is no fancy dinner in the long room at Laws to celebrate. But we celebrated...
I never get to go to the fancy dinner anyway. So.
We celebrated in our own way, didn't we, by reading it over a cup of coffee. And we're both in it. It feels quite immodest to say that, but it's quite exciting, isn't it, to be in it?
Yeah, and I love Wisden. It's part of history, and it's something that's going to still exist in 100 years' time. People will still be collecting their Wisdens, I think, and I've sort of feel very proud to be involved in that from that perspective. It's something that my great grandfather, who was a cricket lover, back in the days around the time of the First World War, he knew what Wisden was, and my grandfather knew what Wisden was, and my grandchildren will know what Wisden is. So it's really awesome like that. I'm really proud to be part of it every year.
Are you going to say who your great grandfather was?
he was some guy.
Okay, that's for another episode. There were obviously all of the usual Wisden awards announced, and in particular from a women's cricket perspective, there were 2 South Africans honoured this year. So Lizelle Lee was named as 2021's leading women cricketer in the world, and Dane van Niekerk was named as one of the 5 cricketers of the year, which is obviously done based on performances over the English summer rather than across the whole year. So thoughts on Dane perhaps, Sid? Do you want to kick us off with that?
Yeah, I think the important thing to remember is it's not even just quiet performances in the English summer, it's about the impact on the English summer.
Yes.
And I think that it's really key that the 100 was obviously, kind of did change things a lot, and it was a really significant tournament. And the Oval Invincibles came through the pack and won that, and I think that she was a huge part of that. And it's kind of interesting the way that we look at these things, because we often we kind of accept in cricket that the best player isn't sometimes the most important player, but it's something that we sort of ignore a little bit as well. And the reason I say that is because whenever we talk about like an important player that isn't the best player, someone we often hark back to is Mike Brearley, because everyone always goes, oh yeah, Mike Brearley, because he was basically England captain and he wouldn't have been in the team if he hadn't been the captain. But I think the very fact that we're kind of harking back to someone that was playing for England when I was still in short trousers, which unfortunately is quite a few years ago, is kind of recognises that it's something that, while we talk about it a lot, we don't always give people a lot of credit for not necessarily being the best player, but still being a really pivotal player. And I think that's what's going on here. So Dane van Niekerk wasn't the best player for the Oval Invincibles. I mean, she only has to look across the breakfast table to see, probably who was the best player. And other players were really important as well. Alice Capsey obviously played, some significant innings and also bowled really well. But what she did was she was kind of the keystone of that team. She kind of brought it all together, and it was her leadership and on the field and off the field. So there's a couple of significant events that I remember, right? That I remember Alice Capsey talking to you and saying that, when she'd walked out, in one of the early innings, was it the one at Lords perhaps, that she was really nervous and she made a slightly scratchy start, which is unusual for her because she usually starts off really quickly. She's usually banging the ball from the very first. Dane came out and joined her and just, gave her a little pep talk, and that pep talk was what, relaxed her and enabled her to get into playing her game, and that's leadership. And then I mentioned this on Twitter. Her standing back at the trophy ceremony and going to the young players. You guys lift the trophy. It's not just about me. It's about you and it's about the team. And I felt that was a really significant gesture of leadership and kind of a huge degree. You have to be really self-confident to do that, right? Because if you're kind of all about you, then or even if you don't have self-confidence, you go, well, I need to be the one lifting the trophy because otherwise people won't know that it was me that. Whereas Dane was just like, I've done my bit, and I'm confident enough in my leadership and my part of this team that I can let other people have the glory. And I just thought that was a really kind of a moment of inspiration, and that will inspire those players going forwards. And it'll be really interesting to see what people do next year. Really interesting to see if the captain in next year's trophy ceremony sort of feels that they have to do the same thing, because it's kind of something that Dane has set in motion. Anyway,
viewed as a copycat gesture then.
She
was the original and best.
Anyway, so a very significant player and an award given because of her leadership very much, I feel. So now I've rabbited on about Dane. What about Lizelle Lee, Raf? She scored a lot of runs, and at the end of the day, you could not argue with the weight of runs that she scored in ODI cricket last year. But it wasn't all smooth sailing for her, was it?
No, and actually I'm privileged that every year for the last few years I've written the piece on the leading women cricketer in the world, and it, generally speaking, involves ringing them up and saying, you've won, congratulations, which is always really nice, and then getting a little interview with them and getting a few quotes. It's normally a relatively short piece, but it's nice for them to have something to say and be able to kind of talk about their year from their perspective. What I found really striking about talking to Lizelle Lee was I was expecting her to say, oh yeah, I had a brilliant year and it was really great, and this is why I managed to score so many runs. And actually I was just amazed at, first of all, the fact that she decided to open up to me about the fact that she'd really struggled with her mental health in 2021, which she absolutely didn't have to do, and it's not something that I've really seen her talking about very much elsewhere. So that was amazing, and it was just kind of nice that she felt able to share that with me, I suppose. But also the fact that I think that we often associate poor player mental health with poor performances on the field. We think, oh, that will affect them, that will affect their cricket. And for example, people who have previously talked about having struggles with mental health within women's cricket. So Sarah Taylor couldn't even pick up a bat when she was at her worst, and she was just away from cricket altogether. Kate Cross has talked about the struggles that she had with having to be in the bubble but knowing she wasn't going to get selected. And so in neither example it wasn't the same as was with Lizelle Lee. What was going on last year was she was coming out and she was batting brilliantly and pulling out these amazing performances, and then she was going off, and between times she couldn't get out of bed. She was really struggling with her mental health, and I think that shows us something quite important, which is that we shouldn't assume that because somebody's performing well on the pitch, that means that everything's okay with their mental health.
Yeah, you never know what's going on, kind of, behind the mask. Literally, in the case of a batter that's what's going on behind that grill.
Yeah, so I think that the piece, it's brilliant to recognise her achievements, but I also think that she was brave to speak out in the way that she did, and that it teaches us something very important about player mental health, and the fact that the warning signs aren't always the signs that we might expect, and I hope that she can go on and have a brilliant 2022 and beyond, and she said that she feels that she's now kind of back to her best mentally, so let's hope that that's reflected. And obviously since we did the interview, she's become a mum, so that's exciting. Obviously big congratulations, and all the best to Lizelle Lee. So that was the leading women cricketer in the world.
Yeah, that wasn't the only piece you had in Wisden this year, was it though, Raf? Because there was a really great piece by Dr. Raf Nicholson about women cricketers in World War II, and it contains a really interesting pair of photographs at the top of this piece, because it contains the photographs of two women that kind of juxtapose the experiences of war and what it means to different people. So first of all, tell us about these two women and what their experiences were of war, and why these two women are contrasting, Raf. Who were they?
Yeah, well, the piece is kind of about the experiences of women's cricket, particularly centering on English women's cricket during the Second World War, because I think it's a story that's not really been told before, even though we hear a lot about men's cricket during the war. And actually a lot of the women players did go off and do really exciting things during the war and had these kind of amazing adventures, and also the war opened up cricket to a generation of women who perhaps otherwise wouldn't have been exposed to it. So there's a really nice positive story that comes through, hopefully, in this piece. You have players like, for example, Myrtle McLagan, who was one of the early great batters for the England women's team in the 30s. She ends up kind of playing. She's in the army, the women's army, and she ends up playing cricket in otherwise all male officers' teams. And really, and all of the men are quite surprised at how good she is. And so there's a kind of nice, exciting thing there of getting to play alongside men that wouldn't have happened in peacetime, because at that time cricket tended to be fairly strictly segregated by sex at competitive level. There's women who then go off and join the armed forces, and because cricket's being offered in the armed forces, they get to play for the first time, some of them. There's a woman called Joan Wilkinson, who I think is one of the ones that you're referring to in those two photographs, who has a brilliant time in the war. She is a working class woman, born in Lancashire, grows up in Lancashire, and working in a factory. During the war, the armed forces hear about how good she is at cricket, and they go, okay, well, we want you to come and play for us, and we want you to come and play cricket and be in the army. And so she does that, and then she stays in the armed forces, and then after the war, she represents England. And so it totally changes her life and her life opportunities, and gives her that access to cricket and almost like a cricket job at that time, as so much as there was one for a woman, and so how fantastic for her. But the other woman that's in the photograph, that's in that set of 2 photographs, is a woman called Cecily Moore, who was actually killed in an air raid during the Blitz in London. And I think that's a bit of a stark reminder that obviously, the Second World War did take an awful lot of lives, an awful lot of civilian lives, and it's quite sad.
And it opened up opportunities for some, and this is the cricket here just reflects what happened in society more generally. That it opened up opportunities for many, including people like my own father, who had opportunities that he wouldn't have had. As a working class man, born shortly before the war. In the 50s, the opportunities that he had were kind of created by the fact that an awful lot of other people had been killed in the war that might have been competing for those opportunities. So, 2 sides to that coin. But a wonderful piece, and I recommend that you go out and buy a copy of Wisden just to read it. Don't have to read anything else in it.
No, do read lots. There's loads of really good stuff in it. I mean, it's Wisden, for goodness sake. Something that was really interesting, it's always really interesting to read, is the editor's notes at the start, where current editor Lawrence Booth expounds on what he sees as the kind of key themes of the year. And it's interesting that on this occasion he describes 2021 as having been an have to pronounce this correctly, an annus horribilis. Is that right?
I think it's annus. Do you want me to cut that bit off?
No, it's my hen do. I can make dodgy jokes today. I'm allowed. And an annus horribilis for the ECB. And it talks about various.
But surely it wasn't that bad, Raf, because people got huge bonuses.
Yeah, exactly. Obviously, we know what happened with the Azim Rafiq racism scandal, and we know that in terms of kind of on-field performances, the England men's test team, I think I got it right the first time, the England mess team, have had a bit of a poor showing over the last few months, including a very miserable tour down under, actually Lawrence, I think it is Lawrence who calls for the ECB to return the bonuses. He's like, you don't deserve them, put it back into the game. Not going to happen, Nate, but it's an interesting reflection on where he sees the state of English cricket at the moment. But I just think it's quite interesting from a kind of women's cricket perspective to read that, because it's very much a kind of a narrative of English cricket framed around stuff that's happening in the men's game. And actually, if you read other bits of Wisden, it talks about 2021 as actually having been a really exciting, positive year for women's cricket, in the sense of the 100 being brilliant. And lots of other
progress
great
in
stuff
regional
going
cricket,
on.
the Charlotte Edwards Cup coming in and adding into the RHF and an expanded RHF, things like that. Exactly,
and it's just quite interesting because it shows that narrative of an annus horribilis is something that is almost framed just by talking about the men's game, and actually
the success or failure is kind of judged almost exclusively by whether or not the men's team is doing well.
And that's sort of kind of a bit of an indication of where of the sort of status of the women's game, I suppose, which is not great. I just wonder do we think that 2021 was an annus horribilis for women's cricket in the same way? I think that some of those issues do impact on women's cricket. Obviously, racism impacts on women's cricket. There are other things as well, like it may well be that there are people who are helping to run women's cricket at the ECB who did get some of that bonus pot. We don't know. They haven't said who's got the money. And actually, should those people be immune from criticism? Should it all be framed as a debate about the men's game? Because otherwise, what you get is kind of huge turnover in the personnel of those running men's cricket, like, for example, all of the debate about Rob Key coming in as the director of English men's cricket, there being all these concerns about, people saying he's going to do a brilliant job, but obviously we don't know, and he's got a lot of pressure building for that role, whereas feels like the people who are kind of the directors of women's cricket are almost like then just stay in place and they're immune from criticism, and that's not really right, is it?
Yeah, there needs to be something in the middle where you've got an acceptable degree of judgment for the women's game, because there definitely are criticisms you can make of the way things that are developed in the women's game. But on the other hand, it's equally true that that most of what we have to say genuinely remains positive for the last few years. I think I know that we still have a reputation at certain cricket boards of being quite critical, as a website and kind of as individuals, but actually we've been largely supportive, I think, of most of the changes that have happened over the last few years, and there have been a lot to get excited about.
Yeah, there have. It just needs to be measured, doesn't it? And it needs to be balanced with saying what we could do better. Okay, well that's Wisden. As Sid says, go out, buy a copy, it's great. And I'm not saying that because I'm in it. I'm not only saying it because I'm in it. Okay, now Sid, final talking point of the week. Our season has officially got underway, our women's domestic season here in England, and we were out last weekend watching some county cricket, weren't we?
Yeah, we went down to Berkshire, or along the road to the other side of Berkshire, and we saw Berkshire against Shropshire. Let's get that right. And yeah, we saw one game a little bit one-sided and one game a little bit more two-sided. Berkshire won both those games, but they were reasonably competitive games and probably the sort of thing we want to be seeing in county cricket. It wasn't elite standard cricket in the I don't think that anyone will pretend that. Mia Rogers, who was the one professional, that's not correct, is it? But the one person who's played some professional or semi-professional cricket, obviously she gets paid for appearance match fees for the Sunrisers, so you definitely would have to count her as a semi-professional. So she kind of dominated the day, really, didn't she? She got 50 runs in the first match and then got more runs in the second match. But it was great to see everyone out there and enjoying their cricket, and showed how much county cricket means to these girls. Freya Johnson at the end, she took 4 wickets in the final over, of the second match for Berkshire, kind of got them over the line, and she was just so delighted to be playing, and it's just like, that's what for me county cricket is about, and I hope we can maintain that going forwards. So really enjoyed doing that. There were obviously lots and lots of other games on show. We're not going to go through all of them because we'd be here all day. We do want to briefly mention the Middlesex Huntingdonshire thing that happened, because that shows that we still haven't got it quite right. Isn't that right, Raf?
Yeah. So Middlesex have been really strangely placed in this group alongside Hertfordshire, Buckinghamshire, and Huntingdonshire, who you mentioned that they played last weekend, and they played them in 2 games, and I think that they absolutely smashed them in both games. I think the second match they won by 180 runs or something ridiculous. A total mismatch, and really not very useful, even if you're a Middlesex supporter. It's just it's not competitive. It doesn't really do anything. It doesn't. If you're a if you're a Sunrisers professional who's trying to use county cricket to warm up for regionals, that doesn't help you, because obviously you're going to be facing much stiffer competition in a few weeks' time in the RHF Trophy, and also in the Charlotte Edwards Cup, which is first. That doesn't really help at all. If you're Huntingdonshire, then how demoralising for you to be playing against a team that's stuffed full of people who, some of whom are professionals, most of whom did play in Division 1, because Middlesex were traditionally a Division 1 county. It doesn't make any sense for them to have been put in that group, and it just shows that whoever's kind of trying to run this thing at the ECB, it's messy and it's difficult when you're trying to do it on the basis of partly on minimising travel and partly on trying to kind of categorise the counties.
We should say, for the benefit of viewers that from overseas and things, that it does geographically make a little bit of sense.
But it doesn't make sense in any other way, and I think that if you ask Middlesex, they'd say we'd rather travel further and play better cricket than travel smaller distances and just wipe out the opposition. And you can't really see anything other than them annihilating the other 2 teams in their group as well. So that seems to be a bit silly. I think that it shows that in some ways this new county structure that the ECB have put in place for T20s, whereby it's all done totally artificially, and they just go, right, these 4 teams are in a group, these 4 teams are in a group, these 4 teams are in another group, and there's no promotion, there's no relegation, there's no movement between. It's just all, you know, everything or nothing, these few matches in the season. It doesn't work.
Yeah, so what we're bringing up here really, I think, is the fact that having Mia Rogers come from Sunrisers and play for Berkshire and be the only kind of semi-professional player in that game can lift things up a bit, and everyone can look at her and see the way that she's approaching her game. They can see the way that she prepares, they can see the way that she actually bats on the field and the way that she keeps wicket, and people can learn something from that. Whereas when you have a Middlesex team turning up that contains like 8 people that have played professional cricket, then and you get absolutely smashed, then that's far too much, and you don't learn anything like that.
Well, you're talking about Mia Rogers playing for Berkshire. If Naomi Datani was going to go and play for Huntingdonshire, then that's a bit of a different thing, isn't it? But they're all playing against, so it's a team of semi-pros against a team of amateurs essentially, and that just doesn't do any good. Anyway, we've banged on about this for long enough, but basically whoever's running it at the ECB, sort it out. Do you think they'll watch?
I doubt it.
Okay, good. Right, well that's all for this week. I need to go and get ready, Sid. I'm so excited.
Okay, well, enjoy yourself, Raf.
Thank you very much.
We'll be back here next week, unless Raf's in jail for various hen nights.
Misdemeanors. It's not going to be that dodgy. Anyway, okay, I'll fill everyone in on how it went next week. See you then. Bye-bye.
Bye.